Hi, everybody. My name is TJ Pache. I'm the Director of Partnerships at the Elections Group. For anybody who is joining us for the first time, the Elections Group is a team of election experts who support election professionals through collaboration, thought leadership, and elevating best practices. Everybody at the Elections Group previously worked in election offices, so we know firsthand the challenges faced by election officials. We use our real-world experience to help folks solve those challenges. We are very, very excited today to be hosting this webinar in partnership with our friends and colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We have three excellent panelists who are joining us today to present on their research that was conducted through the Election Workforce Advisory Council. They'll be able to share more of their work today. I'm going to turn it to short intros from me before giving it to folks to give longer intros on themselves. And then what we'll do is go give folks the opportunity to present on some of their research before jumping into Q&A. So we're very lucky to have, and I apologize and please excuse me for any mispronunciations, Rudabeh Kishi from the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University, Hugo Liao from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and Josh Farrar at now American University, previously at UCLA. Turn it to you, Liao, or Hugo, to give a short intro of yourself before going to Rudabeh and then Josh.
Sure. Good to see you, everyone. So my name is Hugo Liao, and I'm currently working at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So this is a study that my colleague David Kimball and I were doing from 24, and very glad to be invited to join you today.
Excellent. Rudabeh?
Hi, I'm Rudabeh Kishi. I'm the Chief Research Officer at the Bridging Divides Initiative. We're a nonpartisan research initiative housed at Princeton University, where we track and mitigate political violence in the U.S. One of the projects that we look at is understanding threats and harassment against local officials. So looking forward to sharing some of our findings from that work.
Amazing. Josh?
Hi, everyone, I'm Joshua Farrar. When I was starting this research, I was a graduate student at UCLA, and sign of how many years has gone into this. I'm now an assistant professor of government at American University, and I'll be presenting work along with my colleague Dan Thompson at UCLA. So looking forward. Thank you for having me.
Amazing, excellent. Who wants to go first in terms of presenting their research? I was thinking, Rudabeh, you could kick us off.
Sure, happy to. I've got a few slides to share. Can you all see these?
I think we can. Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. So I was hoping to talk a bit about how our work at the Bridging Divides Initiative that I just mentioned can shed light on how hostility impacts election officials and democracy over time using our multiple longitudinal data sets and projects. So I don't need to tell you all threats and harassment against local officials, including election officials, of course, endanger their safety, impede their ability to discharge the duties of their office, and really undermine democratic governance. And so our Understanding Threats and Harassment Against Local Officials, or UTH project, uses a mixed methods approach, including nationally representative surveys, in-depth interviews, and a longitudinal event data set to analyze really key trends in hostility and to support efforts to respond. Our threats and harassment event data set, or the THD, which is publicly accessible for download for you all if you should be interested, looks at local officials writ large, and so that includes election officials, of course, alongside other types of local officials. And that allows us to not only explore the experience of election officials over time, but also to be able to compare their experiences to those of other local officials. Our survey and interview work has focused more specifically on elected and school board officials, but the lessons learned from that research, I think, applies largely to the experiences of local officials across all sectors of government. So I think there could still be some lessons learned from that work too, and I'll try to touch on that a bit. So here are a few findings that make use of our threats and harassment data set to better understand the experiences of election officials, especially vis-a-vis other local officials. For example, you can see from the graph here that unsurprisingly, election officials and poll workers, which are in orange on this graph, tend to see disproportionately more hostility during the lead-ups to November's when elections tend to be held, and fall-offs generally occurring in the following months and into the summer. Rates of hostility against election officials, perhaps expectedly, cool or disappear entirely during summer months. But our data is only partial. It starts in 2022, and higher rates of threats and harassment against election officials might correspond to, with the national election cycle, which is why rates were proportionally lower in 2023, which was an off year. But other types of local officials in blue here experience hostility more consistently, temporally, and without it being linked to election cycles. These officials tend to see more targeting in response to specific local events, for example, or often see hostility that takes the shape of national debates. But beyond temporality alone, the experiences of election officials also align in some ways with those of other local officials, but they're distinct in other ways. So, for example, election officials and other types of local officials all tend to see similar rates when it comes to intimidation, invasion of privacy. That's in blue on the graph here. But where their experiences seem to differ is in how election officials, which is the bar on the right, seem to be more likely to experience threats that involve death, physical harm, or violence, which is in red on the graph, relative to their counterparts. And this might be the result of elections having been a particularly hot button issue, for example, but admittedly, we'd need to explore that trend in more detail to be able to uncover exactly why that might be. But this shows some of the differences in experiences. While some of the risks and challenges that election officials face are more unique, we were just discussing, but something we've learned from our survey and interview work, which admittedly doesn't include election officials specifically, but like I said, I think there's some lessons learned about the experiences of local officials more largely that we can glean, is that hostility has really tangible negative impacts on officials' willingness to engage in democratic and civic behaviors, which can serve to close civil space, chill participation, etc. Local officials have told us in surveys and interviews that they're less willing to run for re-election or to participate in public events or to post on social media and a whole host of other behaviors. We've also found that even when officials are not experiencing hostility themselves, that worry about experiencing such hostility, especially as it has become increasingly commonplace, can in and of itself have very similar effects in impacting officials' willingness to engage in political processes and really just have a chilling effect more largely. And what's particularly concerning is that women, minority officials, younger officials, who are really disproportionately experience this type of worry relative to their counterparts. But knowing more about how hostility impacts officials, what types of threats or harassment they may be most susceptible to, and having really a better understanding of the temporality of the experiences of election officials in particular, all really means that mitigating efforts can be prophylactic as well as reactive, which I think opens up more opportunities for solutions. If you're interested in BDI's Understanding Threats and Harassment Against Local Officials project, you can navigate to it at the URL listed here on the slide. There you can access all three of the projects I mentioned, the threats and harassment data set, the survey work that we do with Civic Pulse, as well as findings from our qualitative interviews. And I hope you'll reach out if we don't get to all of your questions later today, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A that's about to come. Thanks.
Amazing. Josh, you want to go second?
I am happy to. Just set these up here. Looking good on the slide visibility.
Amazing.
Great.
Nicely designed slides, Josh. I appreciate it.
Well, a lot of the design, I have to thank this, my co-author here, Daniel Thompson. I'm excited to share some of our work on retention and resiliency of local election officials. So the run up to 2024, this will be unsurprising to a lot of the folks on this webinar, but there were a lot of concerns that election officials were leaving at unprecedented rates. And these concerns we're edging into the fact that turnover could lead to problems with the quality of election administration, that election officials, so many were leaving that they couldn't find quality replacements, and it might lead to issues on election day. And so these are the two questions that we look at with this project. First is really identifying what turnover looks like. Has it been increasing over time? And second, this really important question of, does election official turnover degrade the performance of the new officials coming in? So in order to answer this, we collect and clean election official directories across the country and link leader tenure to election performance measures. And just to give the broad overview, we find first that turnover is increasing steadily with out of trend recent uptick. And we find kind of across the board that turnover does not significantly degrade the voter experience. And we also look at explanations for this, our two being that it seems like those new officials coming in have relevant skills and experience, and potentially that leadership doesn't have a large effect on the voter experience overall. So a little bit more information about this data set. This is really comprehensive, and this is something that we were seeing as a deficit with previous data sets. We got every single election official who was serving in the November general election, grabs from 2000 to 2024 from every election jurisdiction in the country. So this is over 6,000 jurisdictions, ending up around 20,000 unique election officials. We got a lot of this data from archived state websites and documents, as well as from communication with officials on the ground. And then we did a lot of work to manually clean this. And then we linked this data with outcome measures, including voter turnout, residual vote, which is the number of votes cast for high office versus turnout, as well as self-reported problems voting, voting confidence, as well as voter wait times. So here is what the turnover rates look like. So this is data from 2000 to 2024, and this is a 4-year measure of voter turnout, election official turnover. And so the 2004 dot there is about 28%. So that means that the election officials that were serving in 2004, 28% of them were different from those who served and oversaw the 2000 presidential elections. So you see this big increase over time. In 2024, the latest grab, average turnover rates at the 4-year measure were over 40 percentage points. So this is about a 50% increase over time. Then we also fit just a basic trend line. This is from 2004 to 2020 to show over time there's been this general gradual increase in turnover rates. So this is a long-term issue. And then as you see in the recent years in 2002 and 2022 and 2024, we definitely see this out of trend increase. So it looks like not only is there an increase over time, but it has increased at a greater rate over recent years. Next, we turn to this question of, does it noticeably degrade the performance of election officials? One of the top line measures of this is voter turnout. You can imagine big issues coming up due to leadership transitions. At the end of the day, may lead less voters to have a good voting experience or be able to vote. We see no evidence of that. We compare jurisdictions that are really similar in a bunch of characteristics, the only difference being some of them lost an election official and experienced turnover, and some of them didn't. And see, here we see the black dots are jurisdictions that experienced a new election official that had turnover, and the gray did not experience turnover. And if we expected to see a big effect, once we got to this right side of the graph here in 2020 and 2022, we would expect to see a noticeable dip in the black dot. That turnover would lead to some reduction in voter turnout. And we see absolutely no evidence of that. They're basically right on the nose. This similar effects in both presidential and midterm years. This wasn't a particular effect in 2020. And then we also look beyond voter turnout. We find minimal effects on residual votes, on self-reported problems voting, as well as self-reported voter confidence. And then we do see a potential effect on wait times. This is just illustrative looking at jurisdictions that experienced turnover versus those that did not. We see about the same percentage of voters. This is using SPAE data, self-reported experiencing voter problems. And you might see a small difference here. It doesn't turn out as statistically significant in tests. And here is the one thing we do notice is an increase in voter wait times. This is once again using SPAE data. And we find a noticeable increase in jurisdictions that have experienced turnover in terms of the number of voters waiting between 30 and 60 minutes, which is much longer than we want voters to wait. The average effect is quite small. It's in about 15 seconds per voter, but you can imagine that magnifies. So this is definitely a notable effect that we might be concerned about. That looks like turnover does lead to slight increases in wait times. We finally attempt to answer, why are we not seeing a really substantial degrading in performance when we see turnover? So we collect bios of new election officials who came in 2020 and 2022 to see their prior experience. We find the vast majority have relevant prior experience. More than half are coming in. These are new leaders with election experience, and more than 3/4 come in with government experience. And even those who are coming in without that experience, it seems that they're doing just as good a job as the people that they are replacing. So we see null effects across the board, regardless of how much the prior experience the prior official had who departed, as well as the experience that the new official has coming in. We don't see a big negative effect if someone comes in without government experience. And finally, another takeaway of this is it looks like the exact leader may not actually matter so much for performance. We can't reject a null that regardless of who the leader who comes in, that there is a difference in the performance, election performance of that jurisdiction. So we think these are both complementary explanations. We think there's a lot of self-selection, that the officials coming in are well selected for the job, and a lot of them have relevant experience. And now I'll end. I realize I may be going over my 5 minutes here, but the next research direction here, we've identified turnover is increasing, doesn't seem to be great experience, but this overtime increase may be worrisome for other concerns. This is real lived experiences on the ground. As Rudabeh was just showing, a lot of these officials may be leaving because they're experiencing death threats. So we want to find ways that we can reduce increases in turnover. So we've done some work on workload, looking at the number of elections that these election officials are running each year. And this is just some initial map showing the average elections that the election officials ran between 2014 and 2020. We see a lot of variation, but we also see a lot of jurisdictions, election officials are being asked to run a lot of elections. This is within each calendar year. So the average is over 2. We think this may be one way we can look to, where maybe consolidating election dates may reduce the strain on election officials. I'll leave it there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing, amazing. And as folks are hearing these presentations, please don't hesitate to put questions in the Q&A. We will make sure we get to the majority of those toward the end. Let's go to Hugo.
Sure. Let me share my slide here. Can you see this?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, TJ. Good morning, everyone. David and I, we are looking at the forces driving turnover intentions among local election officials. So we know from previous surveys that turnover among local election officials reached quite high levels in 24. We noticed that about 1 in 5, where that is 20% of officials say they may not continue through the 26 midterms. So we believe that may not be just a staffing problem, it's a direct threat to the institutional knowledge of the election system. So our research focused on 2 major environment stressors. One is resource shortage, the other one is safety concerns. So our central question basically was, how do these environment pressures translate into intent to leave? So first we tested Herzberg's 2-factor theory. So according to this 2-factor theory, they basically suggest that addressing resource shortage and safety concerns, according to Herzberg, that's just hygiene factors, they might stop frustration, but they won't necessarily create satisfaction, which means those factors, resources and safety, they are not that important for retaining employees. We just wanted to test whether that's true with election officials. And then we also investigated whether certain personal qualities could buffer the stressors. We looked at psychological empowerment. That's a feeling of meaning and impact in one's work. And also public service motivation. That's a deep commitment to public service. We wanted to see if they could buffer the impact of the environment stressors. So the data. So the data that we collected, so we collaborated with the Reed College to survey local election officials nationwide. We conducted our survey in the summer and fall of 24. And for the survey, we send out our questionnaires to over 3,000 officials to ensure there is a wide range of jurisdiction sizes. And a total of about 659 local election officials responded to our survey in 24. That was a response rate over 20%. So what did we find from our survey here? So first, we see that resource and safety pressures directly undermine election officials' job satisfaction, which in turn increases their turnover intentions. We argue that resources and safety are not just hygiene factors. They also serve as motivational functions. Having the tools and security to do their job well fulfills a deeper need for self-actualization and achievement. And next, we found that psychological empowerment or public service motivation is not magical. Psychological empowerment cannot mitigate the stress. And for officials with high public service motivations, we actually find that safety concerns would have an even stronger negative impact on their satisfaction. So their deep commitment seems to make them more disheartened when the public they serve responds with hostile attitudes. So the bottom line that we are suggesting here is that we cannot rely on the bravery or the sacrifices of individual officials. Structural and institutional support is extremely important. Safeguarding the election processes must be a shared commitment. It's not a burden that can be shifted onto the shoulders of election officials. So that's a brief introduction about her research. Looking forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing. I see we've got some questions in the Q&A. Josh is working through those that can be responded to in writing. But I want to go back to PSM stands for Public Service Motivation in that slide. Sorry, got one of the Q&A questions. All right, well, let's go to Rudabeh. Rudabeh, you mentioned the fact that you all do research on lots of different public officials, many of them elected. I'm wondering what you all have learned, what mitigations, what things other areas of government are doing in the face of threats, in the face of these types of things to make it so that work sucks a little less for them, and what kind of stuff can we do or can the community do for election officials?
Thanks, TJ. So in terms of lessons learned, I guess, from other public sector fields that election administration folks can borrow from, a lesson that we've learned from our survey and interview work that looks at other public sectors is that hostility, as well as worries about hostility, can really suppress participation, particularly for already marginalized populations in democratic service that I touched on. And so in a policy brief that we published earlier this year, and I could share a link in just a moment if there's interest, we shared some lessons learned based on strategies to mitigate public hostility and protect civil spaces based on our engagement with local officials through the surveys and interview work that I was mentioning. And so some strategies that we found include things like setting up hotlines for reporting threats and harassment, really modeled after existing like state hate crime hotlines. That approach can help strike a balance between collecting, both useful data, but also respecting individual privacy while fostering public trust in government systems, really. And independent research conducted by third-party organizations, like our publicly available THD database, for example, can really further support risk assessment efforts without requiring government employees to really monitor and report on their own experiences per se. Other strategies are providing meaningful support for election officials and poll workers by enhancing really structured systems, like building stronger peer-to-peer networks, expanding training for city attorneys and law enforcement on how to respond to threats, things like ensuring access to mental health care, de-escalation training, community safety resources, things like that, which are especially even more important in rural or undersourced areas. Or that's, what we hear from local officials themselves. And it's also important to offer really, clearer guidance to help officials recognize when hostile behavior becomes really a serious threat and understand what options and protections are really available to them under state law. And then in the long term, I'd really say that there have to be efforts to counter the normalization of hostility and to hold perpetrators accountable. The strategies that I just mentioned really help to treat like the symptoms per se, right, of this problem, but we also need to be taking steps more largely to treat like the disease as a whole too. But maybe I'll pause there in case others want to add something too.
Josh?
Sure, yeah. I think it's helpful. We've kind of been grouping these into two different families of causes of increased turnover. And they just follow from the data we're seeing, the trends. We definitely see this spike recently, which is very much a concern. I think a lot of it may be due to the new political environment where we're in, increased hostility. But we also see this long-term increase, even before 2020, where there were substantial overtime increases. And we think those are more due to structural changes in the job, increased complexity of the role, an aging workforce, and just the job has gotten more difficult and perhaps compensation hasn't caught up. So I will read in. So we published a report with the Bipartisan Policy Center with Rachel Uri as a co-author, where we made a number of recommendations for solutions which will hopefully make the job suck less for election officials, because a lot of them love what they do. A lot of them have a strong public service motivation. And the flip side of our numbers is more than half of them are staying on the job for over 4 years. And a lot of them stay on for a long time. So how can we make the job more appealing to make sure that we can get talented officials and keep them? And so some of the big solutions that the Bipartisan Policy Center is promoting, and Dan and I support these initiatives, are strengthening support and resources for new and experienced election officials. A lot of work has been done to strengthen state level associations, and we think those are really vital for providing a network to help both new and more experienced election officials with the job. And that will also help enhance institutional knowledge and experience. This is also something that's really important at the jurisdiction level. So when there is turnover, the new official isn't just thrown into the dark. They have a lot to go off of. Another big piece of this is fostering collaboration between counties and states, the federal entities getting involved and helping with election administration. And finally, there's a really important funding piece. Some of this is election official pay has not kept up. And this is a problem across the federal workforce and the state and local workforces. Pay has never been competitive, and it's gotten less competitive. So that is a problem. But also there's a lot of stress for these election officials because they're being asked to do more with less. Funding cuts are across the board, and it's really stressful if they're being tasked with running an election, but not given the funds to do it. So more stable sources of funding would go a long way. There's been occasional federal infusions of funds. We have a lot of aging equipment that was bought around HAVA in 2002, and a lot of no ideas where they're going to find the funds to replace that. So increasing funding is I'd say that's always a solution, but it seems like that is a key one here.
Yeah, and I'm listening to the additional resourcing, some of the safety concerns. You mentioned those as like core hygiene factors, right? Like, and I think perhaps in the past, and maybe still, or definitely still, I'll step that back, there was this belief or understanding that folks, public service motivators or public service motivation, you're doing this job not for the money, not for the glory, but because you believe it's important. Can you talk, or can anybody talk about some of the shifts that your research has uncovered in that not necessarily being true and folks needing a little bit more than the warm feeling of a job well done?
Yeah, I just want to clarify the hygiene factor a little bit. So Herzberg, his two-factor theory basically suggests that there are two group of factors that are important. One is hygiene factors, as we mentioned, could be resources, resource availability and safety, working conditions, that type of factors. The other one is self-actualization, promotion, achievement, self-direction, that kind of factors. They are motivational factors. And Herzberg basically was saying that hygiene factors can prevent people from being dissatisfied, but they cannot motivate people. So, in other words, even though you have good working conditions, you are still going to leave. It's still possible they're going to leave because your motivations cannot be satisfied. But our research, our findings show that those hygiene factors, resources, and safety do matter for election officials. Um, Maybe it's because of their unique nature of work. Maybe it's because of this unique environment, political climate. Those factors do have motivational functions. They send signals to election officials about whether how they are being valued and how they are being appreciated. So those factors are important. Those factors are not just hygiene factors. They do carry this motivational functions.
Awesome. Josh, I think one of the fundamental questions I have, and I don't know how much you got into this in your research or how much you're looking at it or how much existing like public administration or government research exists, but is turnover always a bad thing?
This is one of the key motivating factors for our work beyond the election community and more towards the public administration community, because we've heard a lot about turnover is going to lead to the end of free and fair elections, right? That's a lot of alarmist reports, and so that's part of what we're fighting against. Part of it is there's a lot of existing theories to suggest that turnover is not only not going to lead to a bad outcome, but could even be beneficial. A lot of this comes from more broadly, like elections. A lot of election officials are directly elected, where you need regular turnover. Like there's some good evidence now that turnover leads to positive outcomes. In some cases, with the sense that if the incumbent is really safe, they won't feel any need to work particularly hard. Whereas if you have a new person coming into office who just won an election, they might be particularly attuned to doing as good a job as possible in order to secure re-election. So there are good theories there that turnover is not only won't have no effect, but will actually be positive. Less clear in these bureaucratic and like administrative roles where maybe we do want experience. But I think what we add to is this idea that turnover could be bad, it could be good. It really depends on the specific case. And we are connecting our work also to work on sheriffs and other local officials, where it seems that the officials that become these sheriffs or the officials that become election officials are just really well selected. That it's not your average Joe who wants to run elections. It's someone who really cares, is really passionate about doing a good job and ensuring that elections run smoothly. And so that's really reassuring for the fact that we see increases in turnover.
Rudabeh, I'm gonna turn to you for this next one. I know you mentioned, as we talked about lessons from other public sector fields and some of the things that offices and states can consider implementing or doing kind of to mitigate some of the effects of these things. Can you talk about how state partners, how offices can translate some of your findings even further into like actionable steps? Like, if I've got one thing that I can do coming out of this, what is it?
Sure. I might even borrow from some of the great recent work from the Brennan Center. They've done a recent survey that finds that officials point to the need for more money and protection from political interference is what they need to really feel more supported. They point to needing more resources from state and local government for really like day-to-day administration and security needs. They find, excuse me, how nearly I think like 2/3 of local election officials are specifically concerned about cuts to like services that are provided to them by, cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, and really how a majority of local election officials really are just worried about political leaders interfering in election administration. So some of the kind of translation of some of that work, especially when it comes to election officials, given that the interviews and survey work that we do that kind of hears very directly from the officials themselves isn't with election officials per se. So I think some of this other great work being done within the ecosystem really helps to shed a bit of light on that.
Hugo and Josh, kind of same question. Are there ways that agencies, state, local, wherever, can implement some of the, like, you guys' work I think is a little different, but like, what are the takeaways that you can actualize or operationalize?
Can I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, in terms of policy implications, I think some of our suggestions would be, for example, like local governments should invest in a full spectrum of supports when it comes to resources, updated equipment, staffing, but also going to, for example, like ongoing training to public education, to like education and also community outreach that could elevate the visibility and appreciation of election officials' work. And also for safety, that would we would suggest that would go beyond just physical security to address the increasing emotional and psychological demands of doing this election work in this highly polarized environment. We believe that institutional responses to harassment and or threats, providing access to mental health support or like a peer support networks, those organizational support and public solidarity, those are very important to election officials.
Right, Josh, anything? I know you mentioned some of the stuff out of from our friends at BPC.
Yeah, I would just again emphasize the importance, especially of these state associations. And this is a really big success story, I think, too, where we've seen a lot of state associations stepping up, becoming more active, also becoming more concerned, of course, about turnover. But I think that is a key solution, making sure that these local officials feel supported, because election administration is really different state to state. You have a different political environment, different laws, different structures. And so these state associations are the best first tool for a group helping to support local officials on the ground.
I see we have a very robust Q&A section. I will revive some of the ones that have already been answered kind of for everybody, but just kind of before we go into the Q&A, looking at your research, thinking about your research, thinking about the stuff that you did, what was the most surprising finding or set of findings or patterns that you thought emerged? We'll start with Rudabeh, go to Hugo, and then finish with Josh.
Sure. I shared a couple graphs in the slides. I would say like the Less surprising for us was perhaps the seasonal trends around, the experiences of hostility for election workers. It's not surprising really to see them really culminate around election periods, of course. But what was more surprising was really the kind of differences in experience that they have when it comes to like the types of hostility that election officials are facing. Vis-a-vis, their counterparts, other local official types. The fact that some of the rates around like intimidation and invasion of privacy, are quite comparable, but then this, experiencing of threats that involve like death threats, physical harm, violence, that those are higher for, higher rates for election officials was, I think particularly surprising, especially because perhaps unsurprisingly, within our conversations with various local officials, within interviews and things, those types of threats really are like they hit hardest, right, for folks. And so I can really see the impacts of those types of that type of hostility they might be experiencing. So that's certainly something that we'll be looking into a little bit more deeply.
So maybe I can just share one slide here. So I noticed that in the chat, someone was asking about the definition of the concepts of public service motivation, and I just want to clarify that a little bit. So public service motivation basically is about the commitment to public service, and it could be divided into several dimensions. Typically, it could be like attraction to public policy making, or your commitment to public interest, and whether you have this compassion of people around you, and also whether you are willing to make self-sacrifice. And the related concept here is, is psychological empowerment. That's basically a psychological state in four cognitions. Whether you think your job is meaningful, whether you think you have the skills, you have the self-efficacy of doing your job, and whether you have this autonomy, and whether you think your job can make an impact. So traditionally, these two concepts are associated with intrinsic motivation. People assume that for officials with higher public service motivation or higher psychological empowerment, they are more resilient. They are more willing to make sacrifices. They are more they could serve as a buffer against external pressure. I think the most surprising finding of our study is that our data does not support that. Personal drive cannot compensate for a lack of institutional support. So, so I think one thing that is important is that turnover may not be just an individual problem, and it's a systematic one. And this requires an systematic effort. The communities and local governments, individuals all together to address this. Thank you.
Josh? Oh, you're muted if you're.
Okay, well, I'm gonna share. Let's see if I can pull it up. This map, because there was some asked for it, and then not talk about it, but happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. But this is once again just looking at how many elections do local election officials run each year, so everyone can get another minute on it. But I do want to talk. I think the most surprising thing that we found was this long-term increase in turnover, and really going into the weeds and looking at some of the past work that's been done on election administration. It's interesting that there were some surveys done in the early 2000s with like Rice University and some researchers with the federal government doing surveys around the implementation of HAVA, and they actually found an uptick in turnover in their surveys that they postulated was maybe due to some effects of HAVA, just increasing the rules and regulations around how elections need to be run. And so I think our research really picks up on this thread and shows like there's been a lot of attention, recent increases in turnover, and I think there are reasons why we should be concerned and why that needs to be addressed. But equally, there should be a lot of attention put on the fact that this is not a recent story, that this is something that's been going on for at least 20 years, and really looking at over time transformation. There's questions of, did we compare this to other fields? We did do a comparison with sheriff turnover, and we find sheriff turnover to be flat over the same period of time. So that's just one office that we also have similarly high quality data for. But it does seem like there's something unique happening with election officials, which on the flip side means we should be looking at not only interventions to fix recent issues with election administration, such as a different political environment, but some of the changes that's been happening over those 20, 25 years, which is the job has gotten harder. It's a lot more technical now, and compensation or whatever keeps people in these jobs hasn't kept up. So we need attention to those long-term solutions that will address the long-run problem.
All right. Well, let's turn to the Q&A. I see we've got a bunch that have already been answered. I'll start with the ones that have not yet been answered. Here we go. Does any of the research look into how newer election officials perceive the challenges of the field? Are they surprised by threats in the poor environment, or do they enter in spite of those things? Also, I'll remark, as folks are thinking, Miami-Dade, bottom right of your map, Josh. If it's Tuesday in Miami-Dade County, it's election day.
Well, I'll just say this is a great question that I don't think anyone has looked at. But it is definitely worth looking at.
Excellent. Maybe we'll have a Josh Farrar paper coming out of that.
I can speak to, not election officials in particular, but some of the things we've found from our interviews with elected officials and school board officials. We see that even if we might not see differences between the experiences of hostility when it comes to worries around hostility, which can have really similar impacts, like in terms of like impacting whether people don't take part in certain political processes or behaviors. We do see a difference with some of the younger folks that we talk to, feeling like they're particularly worried about those types of trends. I think as Josh said, I think there's more we could like pull on that thread. I mean, I think there'd be some interest in seeing like why that is. Is it because they like don't feel like they have the experience and kind of like resources that some of the folks that have been in office, for a long time, like that kind of institutional kind of knowledge that they have, whether they're missing that, or is it like they're just kind of coming into this space within like a unique kind of time period? I think those are terrible, yet I suppose interesting research questions to kind of explore more deeply. But that's kind of some of the trends we've seen around elected officials.
Excellent.
I agree. I think that's an interesting question as well. So our data shows that, so in our survey, we have about like 30% of election officials, their tenure are below 4 years. And for people with 7 years and more, we have about 40%. So I think that would be quite interesting to see the differences between below 4 years and also like above 7 years, to see like if that they have any like differences in terms of their perceptions. That's an interesting question. That's something we can think about in our study as well. Like do a subgroup analysis.
Yeah, here's one that I don't think necessarily touches on any of you all's research, but maybe you've got other stuff. And the question is, how do logistics factor into worker retention and recruitment? So they're talking about being able to create your own schedule, self-advocacy, get responsive feedback, etc. I think this is an interesting one because, Josh, you mentioned that election work has become more technical, has become less like appointment-based and more something that you do need certain technological capabilities. I think as you think about the rise in that, how complicated the work is, folks may decide to go do things where they have more flexible schedules and things like that. Do you think that there's anything to the rise in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I'll add some color to this. So I've also done some work on selection method of election officials, because this I think ties into this story where over the last 20 years, we've also seen a dramatic change in how election officials are selected. And this is mostly in a handful of states, but in those states, it's been a sea change. So Georgia, Texas, California, Minnesota, all these states have seen large numbers of jurisdictions switch from directly electing their election officials to appointing them. And I think this is kind of a reflection of the change in the nature of the job, where it used to be much easier. And I think a lot of the reasons why it's gotten harder are not necessarily bad for voters. I think most of these changes are good for voters, but it also means more work for election officials. More people are voting, which is great. They have more time to vote. But it also means that's many more staff hours that needs to go into planning and implementing these convenience reforms, right? So I think part of this idea of switching to appointed officials is that they want people who aren't running for this job, because the skills that make someone a good candidate may not be aligned with the skills that make someone good at a highly technical administrative bureaucratic field like election administration. So I think some of that is why we're seeing a move towards appointments. And this is both in large and small jurisdictions, but across jurisdictions and many states are seeing this change.
Excellent. Same person asked this kind of in the same question set. How does training factor into recruitment or retention? Maybe to put a point on it, Rutabe, do you think that as it relates to some of the work that you do, what do you think the impact of like an outside understanding that, I think there's certain careers where you go into them and you expect, okay, well, I'm in a career where I can reasonably expect that people aren't going to be happy with the decisions I make, et cetera, police officers, judges, whomever, code enforcement officers. Do you think that training election officials on the existence of these types of threats as it relates to their work, does that have an impact in who becomes an election official or who stays?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just drawing on kind of some of the conversations that we've had with local officials. On one hand, many have said that like they were under no illusions that people would, love every decision that they're making, etc. But that the type of way that they're seeing this response, especially even from constituencies, like from people within their own community, like often people that they like see regularly, that is not what they had expected. This is especially so when threats, for example, extend to like family. I think officials that have said that they have like children, for example, or like particularly ones that have said like, after these experiences, like I'm not really interested in running for re-election or seeking a different office or things like that. That said, when it comes to like training, support, etc., some folks have shared with us about how experiencing hostility firsthand, or even like learning more about the experiences of others, whether it's through kind of us talking about these things more largely publicly, or even from their peers, has allowed them to understand better like what the tactics that are being used against them are, so that they feel like they're more prepared. Of course, those that have had like training and resources of that sort have like pointed to how useful those can be for them. A lot of folks really point to the importance of peer networks, like being able to rely on others, like officials that have that are experiencing similar things. It's really some of the few people that can truly understand, I think, what someone like that is going through. They really underlined that like some of these networks, for example, or like being able to connect with people even outside of kind of their immediate community that are in similar roles has been particularly useful, especially because some folks, you know, depending on kind of local laws, like sunshine laws, like aren't able to meet with their like local counterparts, but they, you know, are able to kind of share these stories when they're looking at larger peer networks. And so really being able to support those kinds of relationships and strengthening those has really been something that folks have said has been useful to them. Again, these are elected officials, but you know, I certainly think that we can draw lessons learned from them for other types of officials too.
Can I say a few words on this?
Please.
So in our survey, as I mentioned, we asked questions about psychological empowerment. So we have about 80% of election officials, they report they have this significant autonomy in determining how they do their job. And also 86% agree that they have mastered the skills needed for the job. So that's a very high percentage, almost like 90% of election officials saying that they have the skills needed for the job. But at the same time, they still have this sort of high turnover intention. According to our results, roughly about 36% of election officials say they often think of quitting their current jobs. And about 20% say that they will look for another job in the next year, and about 17% were saying that there isn't much to be gained by staying in their current job. So I think that shows, I would say, training is important, as indicated by psychological empowerment. In our survey, they do have a high level of skills in their jobs, but I think training may not be sufficient to compensate, as I just mentioned, the environmental deficiencies. Like you still have to have this systematic support.
Right. So I think we've only got time for one more, maybe a couple more, but as we think about the conversation that we're having, conversations that we have about how election work is getting more difficult and there's not corresponding increases in resources, as we think about conversations that we have about possible threats made toward election officials, some of which across the country, they don't experience it in the way that they do in certain areas. Do you think that these conversations, what is the impact that these types of conversations have and this type of framing of the profession has kind of writ large on folks wanting to go into or not wanting to go into this work? Is there an impact? I make no illusions that everybody who comes and becomes an election official, the first thing they do is sign up for an elections group webinar. That's not happening. Any thoughts there? That's from a question in the Q&A.
You know, something that has come up in our conversations with officials has been that they've appreciated knowing that they're not alone in experiencing these, being like us being able to share that, you know, in some ways what you're experiencing is not unique. I mean, you know, put maybe more more gently, but like just the understanding that like you are not the only person experiencing this. And so I think that really underlines why like the peer networks that I was mentioning have been something that so many officials have told us that they have found really useful and like actually like helping them to understand like what strategies other officials are using, etc. So you know, and they've told us, you know, take it with a grain of salt. Maybe they don't tell us that they don't like the research we're doing, but like in our conversations, they have been really forthcoming with how like it has been useful to have a space to have some of these conversations. A lot of the things that they're experiencing don't meet the threshold for like legal repercussions. Like if they reach out to law enforcement, they're told that there's nothing that can be done about it. So many of them say they don't even reach out to law enforcement for support anymore. So this has been like an output, like somewhere to be able to share some of these experiences and feel like it's being documented and taken seriously. So I do think these webinars are helpful, and I think in that way, but curious about, the other panelists and our participants, how they feel about it.
Yeah. Well, I know we're at 1, so I don't think we're going to be able to get to the rest of the Q&A. I will remark that I think it was last year ahead of November, The Economist, it had an article and it was like, worst job in America, election official. And I immediately thought of Josh and his research, and I'm like, ooh, I wonder if that's going to have an impact. I want to thank our 3 excellent panelists for their time and for joining this conversation. If anybody has any questions or any follow-up that they'd like, I will ask the group here if it's okay to share their contact information. Thank you for joining us for another Elections Group webinar. Please reach out to support@electionsgroup.com if you have any questions, and we hope to see you for a future conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, TJ.
Thank you.